Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Arielle Cates. I'm the Director of Programming at Village Preservation, and I'm so glad that you are here with us this evening, along with our friends at the Village Alliance. The Village Alliance has been a leading advocate for the Greenwich Village community for nearly 30 years. As a business improvement district, the Alliance works with area residents, businesses, cultural and academic institutions to ensure that the district continues to grow and succeed. Their mission, which we love, is to create a cleaner, greener, attractive, and more enjoyable Greenwich Village neighborhood for all, which, so here for it. And here at Village Preservation, we have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 programs a year, most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, history and depth, and the value of preservation in our communities. We are a nonprofit membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us. You can learn more at our website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able at villagepreservation.org/donate. So just a bit of Zoom protocol. I won't be visible during the talk, but I'll be here. So please feel free to use the chat to say hi, tell us where you're joining from, or to raise any issues or thoughts. If you have questions for our speaker specifically, please just do use the Q&A function. It helps me to keep track of everything. You can do that at any point during the talk, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So I am very delighted to introduce tonight's speaker. Jeffrey Trask specializes in the social and cultural history of the United States and the history of cities. He has a Ph.D. in history from Columbia University and an MA in museum studies from the Fashion Institute of Technology and a BS in design from Radford University. His research and teaching focus on the aesthetic economy of cities, with particular focus on the relationship between the arts, aesthetic, and stylistic elements of the built environment, and the political and economic relations. His new research looks at the relationship between the design and planning of industrial spaces and the social and cultural politics of urban growth. Jeffrey, thanks so much for being here with us. Take us away.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to present some of my work that I'm kind of in the process of putting together right now. I titled this talk, Recovering the Former 13th Avenue, for a couple of reasons. First, I think it will surprise a lot of people that there ever was a 13th Avenue in New York. So I want quite simply just to explain where it was, how it came into existence, and then how and why it disappeared. Second, and related to that first explanation of sort of where and how, I also want to describe what it was. What did it look like? What purpose did it serve, and for whom? And for what reason was it removed from the city's urban landscape? And thirdly, I also gave this talk the title of Recovering the Former 13th Avenue because I want to focus on the process of recovering its history. You know, in the classroom, I describe this process as historical method to my students, but at 6 p.m. in an online public talk in which I can't actually see everybody nod off simultaneously, I prefer to talk about the process of recovering 13th Avenue as being sort of more akin to like a scavenger's hunt or detective sleuthing. Because in both of those conceptions, recovering entails determining what it is that we do know and what we don't know yet so that we can start searching for clues and filling in the holes in our knowledge. Tonight, my talk is going to focus on these three elements of recovering 13th Avenue's history. And I should, dear, I seem to be, here we go. First, I'll be talking about the sort of what and where it was. 13th Avenue was 45 acres of landfill in Greenwich Village along the waterfront that extended 22 blocks from West 11th Street to West 22nd Street. And it existed from 1837 when the New York State Legislature passed a law that gave landowners the rights to fill in land underwater between the high and low water lines in the city. And it existed until about 1900 when the city applied for eminent domain and the state legislature eventually passed those laws and started the process of removing the landfill from the waterfront. The second sort of goal of my talk this evening, though, in describing 13th Avenue is to move from the kind of geographic what and where of the first question and look at a more granular and community level at what the neighborhood looked like, how it was laid out, what purposes it served for both its local communities and its local economies. And we can sort of think of this, this secondary description as giving us an opportunity to take a sort of a walking tour of the social geography of 13th Avenue before it disappeared in this kind of project of recovery. And then third, as I said, I want to get into the process of recovery and its history. And in fact, I'm probably going to, for the most part, be weaving in and out and between these last 2 points. Because settling on an accurate description of 13th Avenue really depends upon who you believe. I'm going to be looking at what was at stake for the people who left behind traces of the avenue's history that I've used to recover the waterfront landscape of the former 13th Avenue. And by looking at those kind of stakeholders, we'll be trying to ascertain what was at stake for them, why they painted a particular description and narrative of 13th Avenue as they did, and which elements of the stories they told seem to be the most verascible. This talk is part of a larger research project that I'm working on that's going to form a book on the history of New York's waterfronts, sort of tentatively titled Smokestacks and Silos. My book looks at what I call the aesthetic economy of industrial landscapes by thinking about the relative values and meanings that we ascribe to architectural industrial features in our waterfront landscapes. And the ways in which they change and are variable based on different historical moments. Smokestacks, for example, and grain silos, evoke very different things to someone walking along the waterfront's edge in the 1880s than they would to us today if we were to approach the waterfront from a ferry, say, on our way to the beach. And there are also different meanings in the 1890s between the ways, say, the owner of that factory or silo would look at those structures and the way it would look to someone who worked there. And at the core of those differences in meanings, I argue, is aesthetic economy. The silo, or the smokestack represented, and it had an aesthetic value in the 1890s that was directly tied to the waterfront's industrial economy and to New York's competitive edge. In the 1890s, a smokestack might have meant modernity or progress or the potential for investment capital to one set of eyes, whereas to another set of eyes, the same smokestack could have meant the potential for jobs or of corruption, exploitation, environmental pollution. And then in the 1950s, those same objects would take on a different set of meanings in an era when the industrial economy was quickly leaving the city. So the smokestacks would have perhaps meant decay, obsolescence, redundancy. Whereas in our more recent future, in the early 2000s, the smokestacks and silos now might be prominently featured on promotional literature for luxury lofts on newly reclaimed waterfront riverscapes, because now they can be promoted as a kind of an asset for finance capital and for corporations like Amazon in their bids to move workforces in and to attract the kind of workers they want. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about aesthetic economy, but I'm going to be doing it by trying to recover 13th Avenue and looking at the ways in which different groups of people battled out their ideas of an aesthetic economy as they tried to tell the story of 13th Avenue and either make a case for its preservation and fighting battles for eminent domain, or as they tried to make a case for its demolition. These competing narratives that were created in the 1890s to stake a claim for either preserving the avenue or seizing it through eminent domain allow me to explore these questions in this kind of granular walking tour detail that I had mentioned earlier. So let's jump right into it. So what was 13th Avenue? Where was it? When did it exist? And why did it disappear? This is where I kind of wish that I had really great technical and graphic skills so that I could make these kind of animated maps of the Hudson River that would show you the avenue kind of getting built up beginning in 1837 as tidal waters would be filled in with landfill. And in that sort of graphic movie ideal, we'd be able to zoom in to 1 or 2 blocks in particular on 13th Avenue and watch as we see the wooden pilings driven into the seabed's floor and new waterfront blocks formed that would stretch from West 11th up into present-day Chelsea. And we then watch the blocks getting filled out by different leaseholders and different tenants who would establish maritime businesses there in the 1840s. We'd watch some of them and some of their businesses prosper as they built onto their properties and expanded their businesses, while others went out of business and were replaced by other maritime industries. And this process of kind of watching the ebbs and tides of a maritime district would grow, and they would continue until the 1890s, when we'd suddenly see an abrupt stop. And then we'd reverse the process of growth as we'd watch the whole district disappear, really rather quickly. First, the businesses would vacate their buildings in the 1890s. Then the buildings themselves would be razed beginning around 1900. And eventually, the landfill would be removed and turn the avenue back into the Hudson River, where it would be made into deep water steamship piers that would become eventually the Chelsea Piers. While I don't have these graphic skills, I do have these maps. A colleague of mine in the history department at Georgia State helped me to put them together. And one of the things he did was to take some of the old insurance maps from the 1880s and 1890s, where I was able to find some examples of 13th Avenue. He geo-referenced them and put them onto GIS maps today. And then he was able to frame out the areas of landfill and the approximation of the old seawall lines based on Department of Docks maps that I'll also look at a little bit later in this talk. When I first heard about 13th Avenue, I did it when I was reading through the annual reports and some of the archival records of New York's Department of Docks. The Department of Docks was a state chartered agency that had been established in 1870 by the city to fix what were pretty universally understood to be New York's notorious waterfront problems. This was kind of a desperate attempt to maintain New York's maritime competitive edge and its sort of industrial supremacy at the very beginning of the industrial era. Since at least the 1850s, critics had long been complaining about the port's filth, its decrepit piers, and its inadequate wharfage. And a lot of business leaders were fearful that New York was repelling shipping lines to other ports and to other port cities, some of them as alarmingly close as New Jersey. The commissioners of the Department of Docks, I would soon learn, ended up playing a very prominent role in this battle over 13th Avenue and in the construction of these competing narratives that described the avenue because in 1880, they proposed what would be called the Chelsea Plan. And quite simply, it called for raising 13th Avenue and the entire district upon which it sat, and returning to the Hudson River in order to establish these steamship piers that would ultimately become, as I mentioned earlier, the Chelsea Piers. The Chelsea Piers, of course, did replace 13th Avenue, and while they are still on the map, they're not the same piers that they were in 1910. Sorry, here's actually a front page from one of the early annual reports and maps that the Department of Docks published after its founding in the 1870. And here you can see the finger piers. Let me see if with my pointer, the finger piers that would eventually line the entire waterfront of New York. And this would be one of the hallmark accomplishments of the Department of Docks, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Here's a photograph of the Chelsea Piers when they were completed in 1910. As I was saying, while the Chelsea Piers still do exist, they don't exist as they did in 1910. They're no longer in this neoclassical form in which they were built. Today, the finger piers remain, but the original 1910 neoclassical pier sheds are long gone. Now, of course, covered with utilitarian, colorful new pier sheds that house the recreational facilities of the Chelsea Piers. The story then, that I'm telling in my recovery of 13th Avenue ends up, in fact, being the story of multiple erasures and multiple recoveries. And all of those erasures, erasing 13th Avenue to make way for the Chelsea Piers, as well as erasing the neoclassical facades of the Chelsea Piers in order to make way for modern recreational pier sheds, all of those erasures can be explained through the logic of the aesthetic economy. Especially if we look at who the individuals were who were involved in creating competing narratives about the relative value of 13th Avenue at the moment in which its future was being debated in the 1890s. When I first learned about the existence of 13th Avenue in New York, as I said, it was in Department of Docks proposals to eliminate it altogether, to turn it into these piers. And the arguments that the Department of Docks put forward were all about shipping channels and the geography of New York's industrial waterfront economy in the 1880s. And these are fascinating. I'm going to get to that point. But at the moment when I first learned of this, I simply wanted to know more about what they were proposing to demolish. At this point, I'd never heard of a 13th Avenue. And so I started searching for some evidences of what had been there before. At the time, I was on a fellowship at the New York Historical Society doing research on the waterfront. So I assumed that I wouldn't have a problem recovering this history, but I was very wrong. Aside from a few references in the Department of Docks reports, there was nothing. Now, I now think that this probably had largely to do with the fact that the interests of the civic and the business leaders who donated their papers to the New York Historical Society in the late 19th century and had, in fact, very little interest in preserving the record of 13th Avenue, because rather, as would become clear to me pretty soon, it was in their interest to get rid of it altogether. And this kind of reminds me of a dilemma that we have as historians in trying to piece together the past by relying on an archival record that at its best is no more than really an archival sliver. We are sort of searching for pieces of the past through those elements that have been saved and preserved at a moment in time. And it's that difficulty that actually is what I want to talk about for the rest of this talk, and the ways in which we get two very different narratives of 13th Avenue, depending on who was writing that narrative and what was at stake for them. So we'll go back to the Department of Docks. So when the Department of Docks was established in 1870, it had a mandate to oversee both the management of the city's commercial waterfront and the improvement of its infrastructure. The first commissioners agreed that the city's waterfront was utterly incapable of accommodating the immense commerce of the port. Dilapidated piers, filthy shipping basins clogged with both sewage and street garbage, chaotic and overcrowded wharves, and maritime districts along the waterfront that were populated by what a lot of critics considered to be ramshackle nuisance industries, largely like those districts on 13th Avenue, I'd come to learn, all represented the major problems of a disordered and an unordered waterfront landscape. To fix those problems, the Department of Docks combined commercial improvements like modernizing piers and deepening shipping lanes with aesthetic and architectural elements that could refashion New York Harbor from a sort of slipshod assemblage of broken down wharves to an impressive entryway suitable for a world-class city. In the first decade of its existence, the Department of Docks started to build up the city's seawall and its tidal shores by building a wall of concrete and granite and then ringing it with a series of consistent wooden finger piers that eventually would look like the teeth of a comb surrounding the island of Manhattan. And here you can see that in the sort of outline of the island of Manhattan with its finger piers wrapping around the Battery and up either side. This new uniform waterfront edge of finger piers replaced what a lot of critics had previously sort of derisively said looked like the broken teeth of an old worn out comb. And it suggested to many critics more elaborate aesthetic improvements that could even further bolster New York's competitive edge over other port cities. And this is how the Chelsea plan to eliminate 13th Avenue ultimately ended up combining engineering ambitions of building the longest steamship piers in the world with the aesthetic pretensions of cladding those piers in neoclassical sheds of granite and limestone, as we saw in the image of the neoclassical pier sheds a couple of moments ago. In 1879, just 9 years into the building plans of the Department of Docks, Greenwich Village had become the most congested waterfront area along the city's waterfront. Steamship and railroad companies occupied more than half of the new piers that had been built on the Hudson River up to 11th Street. And as a result, we can skip to these maps. And so we have, in essence, here's 11th Street and the stretch of 13th Avenue that would come under contention. This is this area that was the most condensed and congested industrial wharfage area in the city at the time. Steamship and railroad companies occupied more than half of those new piers. And as a result, the rents on wharfage were rising very, very quickly, leading to a number of fears that more businesses would soon start to flee New York Harbor for other ports. The logical solution to this problem of overcrowding was to expand the Greenwich Village business district by simply building more piers north of 11th Street, but 13th Avenue stood in the way. And that largely has to do with the fact that where 13th Avenue was filled in and butts out into the Hudson River is the point where the river channel itself narrows between New York and New Jersey. And it left a very, very narrow channel through which deep bottomed ships could navigate the waters. The only solution was to wait about and skip ahead about 10 street blocks to start building new deep water piers, which would sort of create a neglected space around which nobody was really willing to invest in the capital to build up. So it sort of created this bottleneck of both capital resources and maritime congestion. Let me here explain just a little bit about what 13th Avenue was and what it looked like at this moment. And I'm using here photographs that were recovered from the condemnation reports and condemnation files that were compiled in the 1890s by the city on behalf of landowners and property owners and business leaseholders who wanted to reclaim whatever investments they'd made into the 13th Avenue landscape before it would be condemned. These represent an incredibly rich resource for being able to recover this history and retell it. So what was 13th Avenue? It was a maritime district that was home to lumber yards, gas works, ice depots, breweries, storage warehouses, and factories that produced goods as varied as soap, boxes, horseshoes, and printed fabrics. The businesses that concentrated there on 13th Avenue took advantage of proximity to the waterfront and access to the avenue's slips and to its public piers. But the avenue also, of course, jutted out into the shipping channel at its narrowest point. By 1879, the Department of Docks lamented that the water that had been given up for this 13th Avenue district would have been much more valuable to our commerce than the land which was made, and it will soon be the very heart of the waterfront, and we cannot afford to throw it away. Combining their interests with the Chamber of Commerce and the Merchants Club, the Department of Docks made in 1880 the dramatic announcement that it planned to reclaim 13th Avenue, to return it to the water in order to build the longest steamship piers in the world. Removal of this landfill, they argued, would open up a new water basin into which the steamship piers could be built, relieving congestion and lowering rents, thus attracting more ocean liners that currently were starting to dock in Brooklyn and in New Jersey. To accomplish the new plan, the state legislature would have to amend the original Department of Docks waterfront finger pier plan, and the city was going to have to condemn properties along 13th Avenue, ultimately purchasing them from landowners. Improving the waterfront for the business interest of shippers and industrialists, however, pit the Department of Docks against many of the smaller business owners and their employees on 13th Avenue, as well as the property owners who had filled the land underwater, challenging a number of legal and economic definitions of what improvements actually were. And so here I want to step into an identification of who the stakeholders were in these battles over 13th Avenue as we look at the variable ways in which they told the story of the avenue. At the center of this battle over the future of the avenue were questions about value, and the value, a lot of ways we can see as reflecting changing ideas about political economy of the US in the late 19th century, when local individualized interests start making way for bigger laissez-faire interests of industrial capitalism. The city's application for eminent domain pit business owners and leaders, estates, and their allies in City Hall against a very small group of manufacturers, tradesmen, and their workers, as they all debated the relative value of waterfront space. Business interests wanted an attractive, orderly entryway for the city, one that they believed could be used as a commercial asset to attract other large-scale industrial investment. While local interest on the avenue saw a more kind of practical use value of their neighborhood, one that provided them direct access to the waterfront and to the city's central business district. And somewhere in the middle of this stood the landowners who leased those lots to local businesses and whose investments promised to increase as the city waged its battle over 13th Avenue. So this is one of photographs that I was able to find in these combination reports. And there are several of them that I'll walk through as I also describe the variable ways in which these different stakeholders sketched out a narrative of the avenue in order to make claims for either its preservation or its removal. So the Department of Docks, along with business associations and the city's most prominent newspapers, the New York Times included, all sought to undermine the value of this maritime district by characterizing it as a dreary waste, and they would do so by employing stereotypes of unsightliness and crime in order to justify its demolition. And this campaign to denigrate 13th Avenue's aesthetic value, in a lot of ways, I think we can see prefiguring the 20th century labeling of slums as a planning tool for clearance and renewal that would emerge in cities in the mid 20th century. Opponents of the Chelsea plan, instead, often these small businesses, like the owners of the Brooks Varnish shop, insisted that their modest maritime district was in fact a very well-kept commercial street with important practical and material assets that couldn't be found elsewhere, especially if they were forced to move. Those opponents were represented by attorney Simon Stevens. Stevens was perhaps New York's most influential legal authority on waterfront rights. Before his death in 1894, he was one of the strongest advocates for the property owners along 13th Avenue in their fight against the city. After the city's announcement in 1880 that it planned to seize these properties for its Chelsea improvements, property holders on 13th Avenue attacked the Department of Docks in the public press and through legal appeals. They charged that the Chelsea plan for steamship piers would give corporate steamship lines a monopoly of New York's public waterways, that it was a boondoggle for the commissioners of the Department of Docks, and that it was a colossal waste of taxpayer dollars. Underlying their opposition was the central argument that 13th Avenue, as it stood, was a dynamic local maritime district that had peculiar advantages for the small business owners who had set up shop there, and that those advantages could not be replicated. The battle between the Department of Docks and these local maritime businesses represented one of the biggest fights over eminent domain in New York since the battle over Central Park in the 1850s. Opponents of the plan, like West Side Central Association, a kind of a group of local businesses and landowners, fought for their individual property rights while also challenging a kind of a new capitalist political economy that they argued tilted too far toward the interests of corporations like railroads and steamship companies. For years, local businesses had opposed Department of Dock policies that seemed to favor corporations over the public. Now, the Dock Commission was lobbying for a bill in the state legislature, they argued, that would make it easier to acquire dockside properties altogether simply through condemnation. And the objections to the contemplated bill, argued one West Side Central pamphlet, are that it places into the hands of the Department of Docks unlimited power, that it's expensive, that it is not required, and that it deprives a certain class of vessels from the use of our docks. The small piers and the accessible bulkhead along 13th Avenue offered the public and small shippers some of the very few remaining spaces where they could berth their vessels in New York. The steamship companies, they argued, the steamship companies being able to pay the highest price will monopolize the new docks. Reinforcing the case for the Department of Docks and business leaders in the chamber, the New York Times consistently described 13th Avenue as, quote, a very peculiar avenue, or a dreary waste, or so far over on the west that comparatively few New Yorkers have any personal acquaintance with it, and there are doubtless many who are even unconscious of its existence. The avenue was dotted with a diverse assortment of buildings, ranging from stables and shed structures surrounding lumber and coal yards to sturdy brick factories and warehouses, much like the building in this photograph, as well as this warehouse on Jade and 13th Avenue. That was one of the few bonded insurance warehouse, fire bonded insurance warehouses on New York's waterfront. Smokestacks, grain elevators, business signs, and precariously stacked piles of lumber rose above the streetscape that the New York Times described as choked with dust in dry weather and clogged by mud in wet weather. Because the neighborhood had been built on landfill, all of its buildings sat on those pile foundations, driven several dozen feet into the silt at the river's bottom. Around the lumber yards on the northern end of the avenue, newspapers lamented haphazard piles of lumber littered the streets. In one article, the New York Times described piles of lumber, quote, rising on all sides, suggesting persons staggering home under the influence of a strong drink. Descriptions of crime and drink and vice actually permeated a lot of the descriptions in the city's major newspapers, and they all helped to further paint a picture of a marginal district that had no social value. Papers reported the details of fights of various sorts that would spill out of the many saloons and barrooms along 13th Avenue. In 1878, for example, the police raided a cockfight at Barney Godwin's bar on 23rd Street, and they arrested 12 participants. When Italian hod carrier Joseph Zack fractured the skull of Irish mason Frederick Derrickson with a plank, the papers called it, quote, a race quarrel. The Times found one saloon on 14th Street so unusual in 1886 that it was described to its readers in details that today would warrant a glowing review on an urban hipster's blog. They wrote, quote, it is on the main floor of a huge brick warehouse, 6 stories high, with big iron shutters and doors. Internally, it is like any other beer saloon of a good sort, but externally, there is no other. So out of place did a bar in a warehouse seem to the New York Times that it was likened to finding, quote, a lollipop stand inside a safe deposit box. The comparison between the New York Times' negative impression of a beer saloon of good sort in a warehouse in 1886 to the way one of its restaurant critics would review it today illustrates just how malleable and how dependent these ideas of aesthetic economy are to the larger sort of cultural and economic environments in which they exist. Today, hardly anyone really knows that there was ever a 13th Avenue in New York because it's been so completely erased from the cityscape as well as from historical memory. If our only evidence of its existence came from newspapers like the Times, we might disregard it as the derelict wasteland that it so visibly and vividly gets depicted in those newspaper accounts. However, it's photographs like this one and descriptions of the avenue in the condemnation records that reveal instead a very vibrant industrial district of light manufacturers, warehouses, lumber yards, restaurants, and taverns. But this modest commercial and industrial neighborhood stood in the way of some of the aesthetic ambitions of the most powerful business and civic organizations in the city. And they stood in the ways of some of the ambitions of building a kind of a frame for New York along its waterfront that would make it worthy of a world-class city like New York. Here, I'm just going to very quickly give you a moment to look at a few of the photographs that I was able to recover from the condemnation reports, because they do much more than I can in describing them through the records. This is a block on Gansevoort Street between West and 13th Avenue. These were businesses that faced the West Washington market, as is this photograph in the corner of 13th Avenue and Gansevoort Street. And here on this block facing the West Washington market, There were a number of bar rooms and saloons. Most of them served the people who worked and did business at the market. There were also a number of Rainslaw hotels that had businesses set up in these market-facing blocks of 13th Avenue. Rainslaw hotels, of course, were those hotels that were built taking advantage of a clause in some of the first blue laws that were written into city and state legislature forbidding the sale of alcohol on Sundays that allowed for hotels to remain open. Those Raines Law clauses were largely meant to keep Fifth Avenue hotels open for elite Protestant diners, but tavern keepers in areas like 13th Avenue took advantage of the clause and put cots separated by sheets, blankets, and other partitions in the back rooms, called themselves hotels, and opened up for business. They also would, of course, become prominent sites of prostitution, thus sort of defeating the purpose of the law to begin with. The landscape below 14th Street was scattershot with open wood and coal lots interspersed with well-built brick buildings with bluestone trim, like these buildings next to the Campbell warehouse. Among the more prominent structures was the Brooks Varnish Factory, and the factories of the Brown Soap Company. Brown had been manufacturing soaps and perfumes on the corner of Bank and 13th Avenue since 1882, and it had erected a new 7-story brick addition to an adjoining 5-story building. The Campbell warehouses occupied a full block of modern, state-of-the-art bonded 5-story brick warehouses on the block between Bethune and West 12th Streets. Collier Publishing House operated out of the large Delameter Ironworks factory on West 13th Street at 13th Avenue. It had stood there since 1871, and the recently renovated 6-story Gansevoort freezing and cold storage building stood on the corner of Horatio and West Streets. I kind of give this accounting because it was the accounting that was being given by the leaseholders and landowners to try to get, to first make a claim for the preservation of a vibrant industrial and maritime district, and secondly, to get compensation for their loss in property. Let me zero in on one block in particular to talk about the relationships between the property owners and the leaseholders who did business and employed people on 13th Avenue. Eugene Hoffman was the owner of the southernmost block of 13th Avenue between West 11th and Bank Streets. On this block, he leased parcels to the Knickerbocker Ice Company, to Clark and Wilson's Kindling Wood Factory, to the Van Tassel Elevating Company, and to Thomas DeWitt's Coal Yard. Because 13th Avenue began, I should say, at West 11th Street, the block offered lessees 2 bulkheads, 2 sort of waterfront frontages, one along West 11th Street that faced a large slip known as the Oyster Basin, and the other along the Hudson River. The Hoffman block provided an imposing facade for the 13th Avenue district. Clark and Wilson's huge wood sign framed the eastern corner of the lot at West Street, and it could be seen, it's been reported as far south as Charles Street on the far side of the Oyster Basin. The Van Tassel grain elevator, one of 7 in the city at the time, anchored the eastern corner at 13th Avenue, and it too sort of dominated over the landscape. The Van Tassel grain elevator also had 2 buildings made of, quote, good, sound, and well-burnt North River bricks. One was a 6-story elevator and mill, and the other a storehouse. It also had a 6-story wrought iron tower along the bulkhead of the waterfront for loading and unloading grain, and a 100-foot chimney surmounted by a wrought iron weather vane. Ice barges also crowded this corner lot in the morning hours as horses from the Knickerbocker Ice Company's 4-story brick stable lined up to cart ice that was floated down the Hudson to customers throughout the city. The new West Washington Market had recently moved to 13th Avenue in 1886 from its former location in Lower Manhattan, near present-day Tribeca. And it provided a flurry of market activities within the market blocks bounded by Gansevoort and Bloomfield streets. And there were lots of overflow businesses, and there was lots of overflow business for the nearby stores, hotels, barrooms, and restaurants like those that we saw on Gansevoort Street, such as Angelo Satriano and William Ryan's 64-room lodging house called Satriano and Company, August Spank's Bar Room. This is where the Rainslaw Hotel had operated, as well as Charles Deichler's restaurant and Charles Welg's liquor store and tavern. All of these businesses served a vibrant and active maritime community, not only for the market stalls in West Washington Market, but also for many of the businesses along 13th Avenue. The landscape above 14th Street probably better matched some of the popular descriptions that were in newspapers like the New York Times, because it was relatively underpopulated with very few permanent structures. Instead, the majority of the landscape was divided into a streetscape of triangular sections that were bounded by 11th Avenue on one side and 13th on the other, because of the peculiarities of that waterfront district. They were dominated by the Manhattan Gas Works Company storage tanks. Those extended from West 16th to 20th Streets, from 10th to 13th Avenues, as well as lumber yards, planing mills, ironworks, and stables. Greenwich Savings Bank President Harsden Rhodes said in testimony for one of the condemnation claims that the entirety of 13th Avenue had once been dominated by the lumber trades, but that after the Panic of 1873, many of those companies fled the area. The landscape of towering piles of lumber that were described by the New York Times was now primarily restricted to the blocks along 13th Avenue between 19th and 27th Streets. They were occupied by various lumber companies, such as John Lynch Lumber, John McClure Lumber and Planing Mills, Dolan and Carr Lumber, the Peak and Bogart Sawmill, the Williams Lumber Yard, and Duke's Lumber Yard, all of whom, of course, had a stake in the future plans for 13th Avenue waterfront. In 1886, the city introduced its first bill to the state legislature to authorize its condemnation. But it took 6 years for that bill to become law, as various constituents on the waterfront debated the value of beauty over practicality and public access. With the backing from the business community, representatives from the Chamber of Commerce, the Cotton Exchange, the Board of Trade, and the Produce Exchange all petitioned the legislature. They also called upon socially prominent New Yorkers like Ward McAllister, the creator of Carolyn Astor's famous list of 400 New Yorkers who could fit into her ballroom and thus be invited to one of her balls. With that kind of prominent backing from New York's social elite, as well as its business communities, the bill easily passed the Senate, but it stalled repeatedly in the Assembly. What outraged many opponents of the Chelsea Plan was the way that the public use doctrine of eminent domain was being used to convert waterfront property that many people already considered to be public into new steamship piers that they feared would be off limits to the general public that had, of course, been currently using them. In 1888, Simon Stevens argued before the Assembly that the bill violated property holders' Fourth Amendment rights of due process, while he also questioned the bill's definition of public use altogether. Those whose property it is intended to take, Stevens reasoned, will not deny that its use as wharf property is a public use. But, he made clear, the fact is that it is already wholly devoted to such use and has been for generations. Nevertheless, Stevens probably recognized the deck was really stacked against his clients because he later conceded that the bill's passage seemed to be imminent. The Department of Docks, of course, ultimately won the right to condemn 13th Avenue. In 1892, the New York State Legislature finally passed the law giving the city and the Department of Docks the authority they needed to amend their original plans and to reclaim 13th Avenue for a new river basin. It also recognized the property rights of both landowners and leaseholders on 13th Avenue. And the city began its condemnation proceedings starting in 1895. It took a decade to finish those proceedings, but they followed a general process of moving north block by block up 13th Avenue. By 1899, all of the properties south of 14th Street and north of 23rd Street had been reclaimed by the city. By 1905, all of the blocks along 13th Avenue had been raised, except for one small square block that housed the West Washington Market. Today, it's that block that was occupied by a sanitation department truck yard and is now being redeveloped into recreational space. And it's the space right behind the Whitney Museum today. When the Chelsea Piers opened in 1910, they did so to hearty cheers, elaborate dinners aboard steamships, and well-festooned ribbon-breaking ceremonies. In bringing together commerce and beauty with a state-of-the-art modern transport and freight terminal encased within monumental neoclassical architecture, New York had built what the New York Times triumphantly enthused was, quote, the most colossal steamship terminal that has been attempted on this side of the Atlantic. The grandiose nature of the new piers, serving both passengers and freight, transformed this formerly nondescript waterfront. A new uniform architectural tableau suddenly burst out along the shore, formerly dotted with small irregular piers and shipping basins, smokestacks, and grain elevators. In contrast, the new Chelsea Piers were 850 feet long and 2 stories high. They were built with reinforced concrete decks and skeletal steel construction. While the ornamentation of the sheds was distinct for different companies that leased them, their overall design presented a consistent aesthetic frame for both the water and from the streetscape. From the street, each pier featured an elaborate granite facade with grand ornamental pediments over monumental pilasters and arched doorways. The upper decks of the piers, featuring large vaulted ceilings, were reserved for the landing of steamship passengers, while the lower decks provided modern rigging equipment for baggage and for freight. From the river, the pier sheds were clad in brick and finished with more simplified versions of the ornamental granite and limestone street ornamentation. At the riverside, ceremonial terraces opened at the pier end out of large arched glass windows on the upper level, where the New York Times predicted, quote, homestayers may wave handkerchiefs and greetings to incomers. Hitherto, newcomers to these shores had gained their first impression of New York from the rather tawdry surroundings on which they and their baggage had been dumped. But the Times enthused that the new piers offered, quote, a waterfront so imposing that the foreign visitor will no longer find false impression of the new city. No tawdriness in the way of piers, no narrow, cluttered up thoroughfares across which he must make his way in the arteries of the town, end quote. The Chelsea Piers promised to cast off the city's tawdry past in favor of a new aestheticized frame for New York that business and civic leaders had desired. But the logic of aesthetic economy didn't benefit all New Yorkers equally. Perhaps there was no more symbolic moment during the opening festivities of the Chelsea Piers than when the Oceanic pulled into its new berth, breaking through, quote, a ribbon of British and American colors that had been stretched from pier to pier. The Times called it an epic in waterfront history. For the business interests that had long hoped for a new frame for New York, and one that could help stake the city's claim as a world-class city, the Oceanic's ribbon breaking likely represented an epic story of accomplishment. But for many of the small businesses that had been forced to move from 13th Avenue, it told a very, very different epic story, one of monopoly and unfettered capitalism. When the Chelsea Piers opened, they were all leased exclusively to transatlantic steamship companies. The Oceanic was one of the White Star Line's most prominent ships, considered a jewel in the crown of its parent company, the International Mercantile Marine Company, or IMM. The IMM itself was a shipping trust that had been leveraged in 1902 by J.P. Morgan to consolidate several of the largest steamship companies in the world, and it alone occupied 5 of the 9 new piers in the Chelsea complex. This was precisely the kind of monopoly that critics like Doughton, Dean, and Stevens had long feared when they battled against the Department of Docks' Chelsea plan. When they were finished in 1910, the Chelsea Piers were the longest piers in the US, and they were the most technologically advanced. They also heralded a new era in civic architecture that reflected the dignity and the importance of New York that many of their adherents had long been hoping for. But peggy municipal improvements to selective ideals of dignity and importance also had profound consequences for the social and spatial geography of the New York waterfront. In the 1880s and 90s, 13th Avenue became a battleground over competing ideas about what kind of working waterfront New York should have, whose interests it should serve, and how it should look. Eventually, development ideas that favored merging commerce and beauty to distinguish New York as a world-class city won out. But to construct this new frame for New York, dozens of businesses were replaced and displaced. The city's charter had to be amended, and the largest application of eminent domain since Central Park in the 1850s was implemented. 45 acres of land were returned to the harbor, but for many of the business owners and their workers on 13th Avenue, an entire maritime district was also wiped out, and with it, a quickly vanishing way of life. Thank you very much.
Hey, and give you a 5-minute heads up. So this is such great timing. This is really, really, really amazing. Everyone, thank you for being here with us. Now is a great time to ask questions. We've got a couple so far, so I'm just gonna jump right into them. Joan asks, did the buildings in the photos face the river, in which case the cobblestone streets face the water, or did the back of the buildings face the river?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I'll try to answer it as best I can. I should have pulled out from some of my research notes these like bird's eye view plans of some of the individual piers that came out of the condemnation files, because you get a better sense of sort of what fronted what. So let me see if I can walk through it without having that visual aid with me. The answer to your question is yes, unhelpfully, right? If I can. So, let's see. Yeah, so you can see here, for example, in this photograph, so it's West Street and 12th Street. So this is looking at it's looking at the property that was 13th Avenue, but it's looking at it from West Street, right? So it's looking west out into what would become river. So the frontings, right, are along. So we have to imagine that every one of those square blocks had fronting on 4 sides. And their businesses, if they were the kind of businesses like this one that would have actual storefronts, would have been fronting either the side street, the Riparian Street, which was the sort of name of those streets that were at the waterfront's edge. Today, West Street would be the Riparian Street, and the anti-Riparian Street, I guess we would say, the one next closest in from the waterfront. But in a lot of cases, because it was a district that was sort of occupied by utilitarian structures, they were stables that fronted the streetscape, or fencing along coal yards or lumber yards. So it would really depend on kind of block by block what was there. I hope that sort of answers the question. One of the things I found, though, really remarkable was the detailed description in the condemnation files, the detailed descriptions of how these individual buildings were built. And repeatedly, they would use phrases to, to stake a claim for the investment capital that had gone into building the structures and improving them. But they would use terms like well-burnt brick buildings and facades with good quality brick from upstate quarries, blue point and trim at the sort of moldings along doors and window edging and lintels. I mean, so these are really solid buildings and not the kind of ramshackle structures that you're kind of led to assume were there if you just read the passages in, say, the New York Times accounts. And I think some of the photographs also are testament to that. The Cobblestone Streets, for example, that you were able to point out, Joan.
Yeah, they look exactly like the Meatpacking District. That's what it seems like.
If you look at this Brooks factory, for example, I mean, just at the top cornice along what I presume is the West Street facade. I mean, it's really detailed wood dental molding.
Yeah, so lovely. Okay. Yes, that's a great question, Jeffrey. Who wants to know, this appears to be a classic example of what we think of as an industrial area. Were there residences? Did people live here?
So by and large, no, there were not residences here because it was a maritime district. And it's actually because of that fact that it was as sort of relatively easy as it was to proceed with the condemnation filings. There's a lot of kind of discussion in the negotiations over applying for and using the eminent domain doctrine that calls upon Central Park as an example of just a couple of decades earlier, and specifically Seneca Village, the African-American community within among the properties that was seized to build Central Park. One of the sort of realizations that Simon Stevens, the attorney who represented the landowners in these eminent domain disputes, made was that he was very well aware that 13th Avenue was not Seneca Village, that there were no people who were being displaced, and there was no sort of ability to claim a vibrancy of community as a means of preventing its seizure. So ultimately, it became quite clear that the only thing that they could do was make a claim for their investments and get compensated as best they possibly could for it and for their lost property.
Got it. Thanks. We have another question from Helene, who wants to know what was contained in the Campbell warehouses.
It's a great question. It was, in part, I'm trying to recall some of the research that I did about 5 years ago. So this is I recall that there was in fact a fire in the Campbell warehouses. And if I'm remembering correctly, there was quite a bit of cotton that had been stored there, probably en route from the South to either New England mills or to mills in Great Britain. The Campbell warehouses would have been warehouses that were leased out to various shipping concerns for different amounts of time to hold goods before they would have been shipped somewhere else. So it would have really been sort of short-term storage for the most part, as I understand what they did. A little bit of sort of more information about the social sort of background of the landowners versus the people who leased property from those landowners, because it is an interesting story that I didn't really get into in this talk, except for it to say that they sort of stood, the landowners sort of stood somewhere in between, right? The civic leaders and the members of the Chamber of Commerce and the property owners in leased buildings. So when the city passed legislature in 1837 allowing landowners to fill in that property, it was the people who took advantage of that law were speculative real estate investors. So the people who owned these plots of land, and usually they owned sort of one of the square blocks along 13th Avenue, were among New York's oldest landed commercial fortune families. So it's families like the DeForests, the Hoffmans, who owned a number of prominent hotels, the Livingstons, a number of prominent Brooklyn families and Brooklyn Heights families who used it simply as investment capital. And then, saw only potential profits in the city's claims for eminent domain and for sort of seizure of these properties. So it was really in their benefit to support this kind of proposal. But people like the owners of the Campbell warehouses, this was a guy named Robert DeForest, who was the head of New York's Art Commission. He was therefore in a position to authorize the aesthetic, the final aesthetic plans of all pier sheds like those that would be completed in the Chelsea Piers. He was the president of the Metropolitan Museum. He was a founder of New York's Regional Plan Association. He was the president of the Sage Foundation, one of the most sort of prominent philanthropic organizations. And he and his wife simply held this warehouse as investment property. So it was a story in which the individuals who had the most at stake on a personal sort of basis had the least power to do anything against it or about it. What's remarkable to me is that the legislation that was passed by the New York State in 1892 authorized and made certain that those property holders through leases would also be reimbursed through eminent domain, and it wouldn't simply be the landowners. It's way more answer than you had asked, though. So
Great. I appreciate it. There are two questions that we have that I feel like sort of touch on what you were just talking about. The first is, were there hotels? Given the maritime element, and also just in terms of the Chelsea Pier building that was put in place. Karen was wondering, when was it taken down and when was it replaced?
Yeah. So the hotels, yes, there were, let's see, there were hotels, sort of. There were hotels in legal record. So when I was talking about these Raines Law hotels, they were a loophole in blue laws that allowed for bars and taverns to remain open on Sundays if they could say that they had bedrooms available. But they turned into fronts for prostitution and solicitation. So there were certainly, right, these kinds of hotels and bar rooms along 13th Avenue, but there were also a couple of others right along Gansevoort Street. They were almost all, though, clustered near the market stalls of West Washington Market, serving sort of that constituency of businesses rather than those businesses along sort of the hard scrabble maritime district. So I think what you're getting to in your question was whether or not there were hotels that were serving a constituency of sort of sailors and seamen. And I haven't any record of that necessarily. I don't know exactly where those were, but I don't see evidences of it in the condemnation files that I looked at. And the question about the Chelsea Piers, yeah. Whoops, sorry. Here we are. So this is one among many. Well, you really can sort of see a stretch of them. What do we have in this photograph? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Chelsea pier sheds. You get a sense of the ways in which they were all sort of offering this consistent neoclassical facade that they all joined arms together. So at no point after the Chelsea Piers were built did you see the actual dirty waterfront from the street level, because there was this consistent wall, right, lining everything. And from the seaside, it was likewise a sort of consistent frame for the city of New York. There were many more of these neoclassical pier sheds lining New York's waterfront than just the 9 pier sheds that were erected at the Chelsea Piers in 1910. Somewhere I have sort of records of them, and maybe Ariel, you know some of the numbers on this, but there were up to about 30 or 35 of them from what I've been able to tell. Sort of
Sounds
scattered
good to me.
New York's waterfront. They all were built between basically 1910 and essentially the beginning of the Depression, sort of the early 1930s. After that point, they stopped really being the aesthetic that was sort of most desired. It's also after that point that the Port Authority of New York sort of subsumed a lot of the responsibilities of the Department of Docks and shifted its authorities and its controls. And they moved away from some of these ideas. But we have, if you just sort of think about the timeline that I was just sort of suggesting, they're built and their sort of heyday is between 1910 and roughly say 1935, but probably a little bit earlier in the 30s. Then from the 1930s up until the mid 1950s, we have an era of depression and very little building or maintenance of much going on in the waterfront. There's some improvements like the elevated highway and the elevated rail lines of both the High Line and the Miller Highway get sort of constructed in this era to alleviate waterfront congestion. But we also start to see a shift toward air travel. And World War II sort of is also like in the mix here. And after the Second World War, we start also seeing a shift of shipping and transport away from Manhattan in New York City out to Brooklyn and to New Jersey as trucking and container shipping starts to become more and more prevalent. And it's at that point that these kind of piers go into disuse and sort of disinvestment. So that by the 1970s and 1980s, these piers that were, very elaborately constructed with limestone and granite, and I mean, you look at some of the sort of heavy ornamental architectural detailing at the tops of them, and you imagine what a dozen, 2 dozen harsh New York City winters would do to them without upkeep. They sort of fall apart. They became dangerous. These are the piers also that are sites of sort of illicit intimacy and sex and public sex in the 1970s and 1980s, especially among gay male populations that proliferate in Greenwich Village. So this is a landscape that just sort of completely gets transformed through obsolescence. And it's for that reason that a lot of them, those facades were simply torn down eventually and replaced by the kind of colorful utilitarian sheds that we see the Chelsea Piers have today.
Thanks. Okay. So we have a question from Myra who wants to know about the geography between 13th Avenue and 12th Avenue, because 12th Avenue is farther uptown. How did that happen there?
Let me see. I'm going to direct you to, actually, let me see if I can't just do this. Bear with me for a moment. Nope. I'm just going to pull out an article in which I've looked at some of this. That's not quite it. This is the worst way to answer a question like this, I think, and I apologize. Maybe that was a good one. So yeah, this map maybe a little bit shows, if I make it a tiny bit smaller, you get a sense right here of the ways in which there was an intersection of the two avenues that makes very little sense, but every New Yorker knows that that doesn't stop us from having streets named in ways that make very little sense. Wandering around the village, right? We know there are all of these anomalies. And in this case, the anomaly is the result of this very short, 22 block long, 45-acre parcel that was built out that has a crossover whereby 13th Avenue starts further east than 12th Avenue does at the point where it does pick up, which is, I guess, roughly about sort of 28th or 29th Street. I know this isn't a very sort of unsatisfactory answer.
Great.
Super confusing. It was one of the things when I first started looking into these questions of what was 13th Avenue that perplexed me so much. Because I would be able to find some examples of it in old insurance maps, like Sanborn or Bromley maps, but it would sort of appear and it would disappear based on which plate I was looking at. And if you're not familiar with these maps, they're giant.
They're incredible, yeah.
They're incredible in their richness and detail, because they'll tell you, who owned what piece of property block by block at any given year. But they're also, because they're so big, they're hard to navigate because you have to sort of like line up through the indexing where, how you pick up on the street that you're going through if you hit the spine of the book, right? And for this kind of investigation, it was doubly difficult because I was trying to locate a landscape that doesn't make any sense to me geographically and that no longer exists in these books that themselves were sort of hand-drawn and open to human error as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Cool, thanks. So
Crazy.
Great. Well, I'm very sorry to Kenneth and Zach. I feel like we could talk for the whole night, but I try not to go past 7:20 just to get everybody out for dinner, basically. So I'm going to ask one last two-part question from Gary and Deanna, which are, how does a historian of New York City's 13th Avenue end up at Georgia? And the other is, when do you anticipate completing and publishing your book? And I'll add mine, which is, where can people find your work?
People, thank you so much. I'll answer them in reverse order, I think. I should mention that so I've talked about the book that I'm working on, Smokestacks and Silos. I've also published some of this research in an article called it's called Constructing the Frame of New York. It was published in 2018 in the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. And I can give you, Ariel, a citation for it, and maybe you can make it available if people are interested in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
It goes into more detail a lot of the history that I was describing in this talk, and it flushes out some of my arguments a little bit more. When can we expect? So I've also a book that looks at the aesthetic economy of New York in this era from the point of view of museums in the progressive era. It's called Things American, and it's primarily a history of New York's Metropolitan Museum and its decorative arts collections, looking at the ways in which the museum after 1905 tried to integrate itself into other progressive era educational institutions like settlement houses, libraries, and schools. And that was published in 2012 by the University of Pennsylvania Press, so it's widely available. I ended up at Georgia State in Atlanta, thank you very much, Georgia, not simply Georgia, because I got a job there, a really great job in the history department that allows me to wear a lot of the different hats that I fancy myself as wearing as a professional historian. I am a part of a really vibrant team of other urban historians in our department. So we're building a strength in the history of cities, which I bring to it an expertise in New York City history, but the history of Atlanta is pretty dynamic, and it's really an extraordinary privilege to be able to teach that history and to use the resources around me there. I currently live, when I'm in Atlanta, in the Fulton Cotton Bag and Cotton Mill factories, or former factories. It was the largest cotton mill in the South. It looks like a lot of these structures, perhaps not like the Chelsea Piers so much, but they're really ornamental, and they are building on these ideas. They look like Florentine castles in some cases, with turrets and great big imposing towers, because they're presenting a particular idea of progress and modernity in the 1890s when they were built. But I'm also happy to say that I vote in John Lewis's congressional district, and Dr. King lived about 3 blocks away from where I live today. So there's this wonderful privilege in being able to be a part of multiple cities and multiple histories.
Well, thank you so much for this. This has been really, really delightful. Things we have in the chat so far include terrific and excellent and thanks. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone who is still here with us, and to everyone who joined us, and to everyone who will watch this after the fact. Thank you so much. Keep an eye out. We're going to send a follow-up email with just a brief survey. We always love to get your feedback and some links. Maybe the article that Jeffrey just mentioned, we'll send whatever we can. So keep an eye out for that, and for a link to the recording that you can share as you please. So have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you so much. We love to be able to have speakers from all over the place here on Zoom with us in the village. So I appreciate that so much. Take good care, everyone. Thanks, Deborah.